Answering atheists. It is said that the God of the Old Testament is so cruel when compared with the Jesus of the New Testament. So why is that the case? If it is the case, indeed. And why do we see apparent episodes of violence and brutality in the Old Testament as compared with the New Testament? Well, morality itself is a revolutionary act. It's not something that we inherently possess because we are brutes. You look at our track record, you look at our history, the history of the world, you will see wars, you will see despots, you will see greed, you will see power hungry people, you'll see the occasional advancement in technology, but with that comes the advancement in the ability to kill. And then you have riches, which can happen as well. Societies can be very prosperous, but with that comes hedonism. With that comes materialism. People getting caught up in pleasure above all else. People feeling meaningless because of the materialism that exists in the world. So you have those things too. And then you have, the development of work, right? Okay, cool. We have jobs now, but it's like, then you have people being underpaid. Then you have people being exploited. Then you have people. So everything that man does, as good as it may be, can lead to, because of man's inherent evil nature, can lead to destructive tendencies. Even freedoms, like freedom of speech. It's like, cool, we love freedom of speech, right? And then you have everyone cursing, swearing, blaspheming, hating, calling to acts of violence, so there obviously needs to be limits to that, Or what about gun rights, right? Surely gun rights is a good thing because you can defend yourself against tyranny, is what it said, right? But you have mass school shootings you have the defense of tyranny argument, and then you have mass school shootings on the other hand. And so everything that's inherent that man creates can be corrupted and can be used for evil devisings. And there's something called game theory, right? It's like you can imagine this world as one big game. It's one big game of Monopoly. The aim is to make as much money as possible and to not be poor. This is very simplistic, but make as much money as possible, not be poor. There's tremendous cheating, There's tremendous rigging of the system that does take place. And the most brutal, the most egotistical, the most greedy, the most brutal, cutthroat, if you want to call it that, tend to work their way up the ladder, No better example this than in politics, right? Unless you're part of a party where you get donors from wealthy people who will give you then millions and even billions of dollars so that you can win, unless you're working for their interests, then you're not going to be getting any money for your campaign, and you'll just have to go grassroots with the people, And those people, that grassroots movement tends to lose out to the big donors throwing big money at the election, And so the ones with money and the ones who get power, and the ones who are receiving money who then get power have to work for the people who put them in there, and those people are the true representatives, people being represented by power. It's not the people who vote. It's the people who can put in the money to put the politicians into power, who then work for the powerful interests. And so that's what's happening in the world today, And so let's revert back to my question now. Why was the God of the Old Testament so severe in his treatment of evil, of humanity, of his ways of doing things tended to be quite brutal? It's because morality needs to be instilled in people through a revolution of sorts. Now, the societies that were in existence understood the rules of the game. The rules of the game in existence in the Israelite times was that if your God was the true God, then you would be the one who dominates militarily. So I'll have Dagon, or I'll have Ashtra, or I'll have Molech, or I'll have Baal, right? And if my God was the true God, then I would conquer you. And my act of conquest was proof that my God was real. So that's not something that God created. That's something that humanity created as his paradigm of thinking, that conquest equals superiority. That's something that we decided to endeavor to create because as I've said, powerful people have a tendency towards extending that power, which could come through conquest. And so this conquest epic that we see in humanity is part of the situation that God is dealing with in the Old Testament. And so he just says, you know what? I'm going to take the gloves off. And this is a revolution that's going to take place. It's going to be a revolution. Because those systems that dominated the world, the majority of the world, there was Molech, there was Baal, there was Asherah, they were burning children in the fire. They were sacrificed, there was child sacrifices and all sorts of crazy things going on. All sorts of ritual prostitution and magic and priestcraft that was going on. And if you think that's not, like priestcraft, like magic, what do you mean priestcraft and magic? Well, take it from the Aztecs. They smoked some stuff and the entities told them all sorts of things to do. Now you may what do you call that? It's even in terms of utility. You smoke that stuff, the entities connect with you, you kill lots of people and sacrifice to them. This was part of the religion, you see. And then temple prostitution and priestcraft. What I mean by priestcraft is that there was a small group of priests, priestly elites that controlled most of society, And they promoted what the Bible calls detestable things like child sacrifice and all this, right? So this was, and like witchcraft and wizardry, which had real world consequences on people, Because then you have people sacrificing to these gods, giving to these gods, being entranced by them, connecting with them in some way. And it was really demonic, What would you call that? You would call that, in scientific terms, a mass psychosis. Humanity's mass psychosis. That whole phase of different gods and polytheism and temple prostitution and wild orgies and incest and polygamy and connecting with these deities, these entities to do things. That was like the mass psychosis of humanity, right? And schizophrenia and all the rest of it. We're mentally ill, okay? And we had a fit. We had a big fit. And so that's what God is dealing with. And then when we say, and then we have the audacity to say, "Oh, God in the Old Testament was brutal." It's like yeah, you when you're up against Nazis and when you're up against very evil practices, There's no persuading people with compassion. I'm sorry about that. God is a compassionate God, and He always operates with compassion. But in terms of persuading these kind of people, you aren't going to go up to them and say, you know what, I think women should have equal rights and they should be allowed to vote. And like, imagine you're talking to a warrior from Canaan, or you're talking to a warrior, an Aztec warrior, right? And you're talking to their priests, right? Or you're talking to Phoenician warriors, right? And they're like, men of war, and you come up to them and you go, you know what, women should have the right to vote, and there should be a redistribution of wealth, and we should all be equal, and put your weapons aside. And I mean, the first thing they'll say is, what God do you worship? What God do you worship? Because what you're saying is like, it doesn't even resonate with us. We're thinking of our next conquest, and you're talking about like peace and all these different things. It wouldn't resonate with them. It's like talking, because what you don't understand is we're making moral assumptions here that peace and compassion and love are things that are desirable. But really they were imposed on us through the revelation of the God of the Old Testament and through the revelation of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. God took us from one point and was leading us through this journey till we get to the end. And as I've said, these it is a journey, and it wasn't a given. We make moral assumptions here that those things that I've just said about compassion and love had to have always been something that we desired. But as Tom Holland points out, not the movie actor, but the historian, he says that, the Romans were brutal people and the Greeks were warrior people, So how do you get the shift from warrior culture to and domination and brutality to love your neighbor as yourself, which is so alien? We think of that now. Like if someone said that now, love your neighbor as yourself, we'll be like, yes. But we have to remember that was not a given. That's something that has been instilled in us through the journey of Christianity. And then when we talk about like temple prostitution and child sacrifice, we're like, oh, that's bad. It's like, yeah, that was instilled in us, the fear of that, the detest of that, through the Old Testament experience, The biggest religious block is the Judeo-Christian block, And you can't underestimate the influence that it had. And so when we talk about the brutality of the Old Testament, I would say you need to look at it through a bigger picture. That God is trying to take humanity from somewhere and get them somewhere. And as part of that ends, there is a means to it. And God says to the proud, to the warlike, to the brutal, I will show myself as a strong war god, And it had to be done, It was because of that mass psychosis that humanity had. It had to have been done. There was no other way around it. That humanity was having, And so now we enter the New Testament, Jesus comes on the scene. What did it take to instill the values of compassion and virtue on the world? It took the whole Old Testament, right? But then it took brutally and viciously beating and crucifying an innocent guy. That's what it took. And not only that, but brutally killing and brutalizing all the followers of this innocent guy. That's how the Roman Empire was being challenged, right? Their morals were being challenged by the Christians. And so it's this process, and it didn't, and did have people in the name of Christianity done crazy things? Yes, you know, because it takes a long time to weed out those things from the human experience. But there was a start to it. And even Richard Dawkins says this. He says, Jesus Christ was way ahead of his time, um, way ahead of his time, actually, to be advocating that level of compassion and that level of love in a time of brutality when the two major blocks are like you kill me and I kill you, and who's going to gain power and who's going to set up a universal kingdom through force. Those are the blocks that were alive in Jesus' time, and it took brutally killing, beating, and crucifying a man, an innocent man, Jesus, to get us out of that. So he took one for humanity. He took one for humanity, and it's a process. It's a process. It says when the fullness of time came, that's when Jesus Christ interjects himself into history, because the conditions of the world were right for the introduction of a new shift in consciousness away from the warrior domination stuff to the compassionate stuff. It wasn't ready for that in the Old Testament, in like Judges, and in like that whole era of kings and conquest and stuff. It wasn't ready yet. But it was getting to that. It was not God's ideal. That whole Old Testament stuff was emergency measures. It was an emergency coup d'etat in a world that was having a mass psychosis mental breakdown by connecting with these entities and witchcraft and wizardry and stuff. And it still happens today, in certain areas. But the influence of Christianity and Judeo-Christian values is huge in rectifying a lot of that stuff, And so now we're in the postmodern era. Now we're in the phase where we have some decisions to make. I think we're a lot more tolerant nowadays when it comes to wars, though I could be mistaken, because we do have major wars taking place even as we speak, and nuclear weapons, and the 20th century was the world's most bloody century. So as much as I'd like to say that we've changed, I think the influence of Christianity is strong, it's powerful, but yeah, we still have the same proclivities, and so, but there is changes taking place in a lot of people. So what's the end of this? What's the end of this process? Like, we're gonna either have to embrace compassion and understanding, or we are going to destroy ourselves. There can be no other war after the next world war because of nuclear weapons. There's no planet B, as people say. This is it, we're globalized now, so we're all in this together, like mental health is everyone's challenge, like poverty is going to be everyone's challenge, wars and stuff are going to be everyone's burden, because we're all so interconnected. So that's the world we're living in, and Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you. So the access to the kingdom is right here in this room where you're sitting. Wherever people are, the kingdom of God is there, And so we do need revival in this world. We do need a big, huge wave of the gospel for all it's worth to permeate in the world, for a shift in consciousness to emerge. And yeah, Jesus will come again to set up his, to take us home, and then eventually to set up his kingdom on good principles, moral principles. So there you have it. The question was, why was the God of the Old Testament, it appears, so brutal? And I've just explained to you, you've got to think bigger picture about this. You've got to think what God was dealing with. You've got to think about where he was taking us from. And you've got to think about the cost it takes and the assumptions we make in this world today that are Christian assumptions that we just take for granted, you know. And so that's all I have to say. Thank you, and God bless.